Hi, welcome to Therapy Cable. I'm Dr. Ehsan Garajadaki. This is the third video we are creating on the topic of attachment styles. If you haven't watched the other two videos, I recommend that you watch the other two first. This one is about the avoidant part of the two more or less substyles of the avoidance category. Part of this diagram. We have gone over this a few times, where basically we have mentioned the dimensions. There are two dimensions that are active as part of components of the attachment style, and one dimension is anxiety, whether a person is on lower or higher level of anxiety, and the other part is the dimension of approachability, meaning if a person perceives others to be approachable, safe to approach or not. In the previous videos, we have given a very in-depth, detailed explanation of this diagram and the dimensions in the first video, and in the second video we went over more or less what a secure style looks like, and what the details of interactions of secure attachment style look like in light of a certain, let's say, disagreements. And then also we went a little bit over the dynamics and characteristics of the anxious, the preoccupied category, and kind of a combination. In this video, what I would like to do is go more into the bottom part of the two avoidance styles, because basically they're regarded avoidant as they're on the low end of the scale of, or the dimension of feeling secure enough to approach other individuals. They don't perceive individuals being approachable or safe to engage with, and even relationships are not regarded as safe. Relationships are regarded as conflictual, as conflict-ridden and full of frictions, and something to avoid. So generally they have learned they're better off staying away from other people because they see the source of conflicts and frictions in relationships. And now, as such, we also have two subcategories, and because they line up on the dimension of low versus high anxiety. So what happens is that let's go through this, which is a completely avoidant and also less anxious individual. So what does that mean? That's really an individual who is kind of better off, if you will, internally, because they are not highly anxious internally, versus this category where a person would be on the high end of anxiety, so they're internally in turmoil. They are not displaying it. The facial expression, the actions, behaviors are not displaying the anxiety, and also verbally they're not willing to express that they're highly conflicted inside, torn apart, and falling at times, even falling apart, and even feeling like they may explode in the moment. Yet they avoid relationship. In fact, they feel that they would, the higher their level of anxiety, the more they should avoid relationships, and because they believe that it's really that interaction that is causing their anxiety. So they want to escape it and avoid it and just distance themselves from the source of anxiety in order to calm down. And that's a very peculiar type of a presentation, which we will get into a little bit, as compared to that pure avoidant, low anxiety, because again, that individual may already be at a level of kind of peacefulness, if you will. They're not feeling highly anxious. They do avoid the relationship, and at the same time they may feel they're actually quite okay. So they're not feeling the same turmoil that this individual feels over here. So they are more I would say regulated inside. They're better regulated. They're better contained internally, and in a better mindset, and where they can make better decisions, if you will. Now, one could argue whether or not that actually would, I would say, mimic and or overlap with schizoid, personality type or this style or disorder, because again, that is also what we see with individuals who have schizoid personality. They don't have, high huge anxiety. They just kind of don't care about relationships. So and they don't feel like they need to be in relationships and approach. But even though they mimic each other and kind of have resemblance with one another, I strongly believe that they're completely different. But it is important to recognize that they may seem as one and the same. And we would have to dig deeper into understanding, is this more of an attachment style that this person is displaying, or is it an actual personality style? We'll get into that discussion later on. Here, what we would like to focus on is that if an individual harbors the more avoidant attachment style, one of these two categories, with low anxiety or high anxiety, how do they interact in relationships? How do they present that in relationships? And then get into combinations of all these four. So now, before I go forward, I also want to make a point about the ambivalent part. So the ambivalent part, at least the way I understand it, is that because of the high anxiety, at times the individual who actually doesn't want to engage in a relation because they see it as a source of anxiety, they somehow may have gotten at times even a wrong message, or maybe even being able to overcome their own anxiety, look at the benefit of reaching out in the relationship, even despite its seeming unapproachability, learning more or less in vivo, on the go, how to utilize the relationship as a source of emotional regulation. That's where we may see them, that they kind of switch to the other side, like kind of actually be willing to engage and approach the other person in order to settle the difference and the conflict, and then lower their anxiety. So we at times we see that, and it really depends on what I would say a conceptual framework, in terms of have they logically, rationally in their mind decided whether or not a particular relationship is worth pursuing and relying upon. So generally, an avoidant style may shun relationships, and when I mean relationships, not in at peaceful times. By shunning, what I mean is that their predicament about staying away from relationships is limited to the times that the relationship is not doing well, that there are disagreements. So avoidant styles are actually not avoidant so much at peaceful times, at good times, and when they perceive the health of a relationship at a higher level, and the communication functional, and their position within the relationship as secure, which happens to be most of the time when there are no disagreements. So it's really relying more on some kind of a happenstance when it happens that two people kind of see the same event from the same angle. They happen to have the same opinions and perspectives. They happen to have the same preferences and likes or dislikes. So at those times, they're not avoidant. They actually are quite engaging. They are pleasant to work with. In fact, they may seem more like secure because they have a level of, I would say, self-regulation. In fact, their self-regulation, especially the ones on low anxiety, is much better than the preoccupied ones because they're not because they're more on the lower end of approachability. Therefore, they have learned how to self-soothe from early on, versus the preoccupied ones who have not necessarily learned how to self-soothe, and they rely upon other individuals to soothe themselves. So because of that inherent and long-term established pattern of self-soothing that helps the avoidants to take care of their inner turmoil, no matter how what scale and intensity it is, by themselves, they may actually seem quite secure at times when the relationship is peaceful and with there are agreements and likeness between them and similarities. So, however, when it comes to a point where suddenly disagreements pop up and differences surface and individuals feel like they can't resolve those differences and then it escalates, that's when these the avoidant individual who seemed up until then quite secure or engaged, they kind of gravitate toward the other extreme of the end of this dimension. So they increase their distancing behavior. Let me give you a few examples now where you may actually see that in action. So someone who is kind of low anxiety and avoidant, they may, first of all, both of these categories, they're not much into let's say opening up and sharing sharing their inner world, and kind of engaging much. They want to limit the time that they're engaging, especially talking and communicating about differences. So they want to get over it as quickly as possible. They don't see any benefit in having to dig deeper and deeper and analyze stuff for no apparent reason. They want to just get over it with it and move on and really just kind of engage in other more beneficial, useful activities on a daily basis, mostly kind of getting things done, kind of work or tasks that they have in mind, because that actually gives them a sense of productivity and normalcy and self-regulation. So, whereas let's say the anxious types, they're more willing to kind of dig deeper, analyze, and open up and share and engage in that deeper analysis and one-on-one learning about each other, including a lot of, would say, kind of inquisitive questions, about these differences, where they come from, and so forth. So the avoidant styles, both of those, tend to, as I mentioned, want to end the discussions, not even get into it. Now, with the low anxiety ones, you don't also observe any obvious, let's say, frustration or agitation. They're generally kind of, cool and low key and comfortable, with simply remaining functional, polite, engaged, but also disengaged. So it becomes a little bit mysterious when you're talking to someone who has low anxiety and high avoidance, low approachability. You may actually feel lost because you're having a hard time understanding them, and they are having a hard time opening up, but at the same time they're not that frustrated. They may come across as disingenuous. They may come across as they're hiding something, or maybe even conceited, or manipulative, perhaps even to some extent abusive, of having a certain agenda, and like I said, manipulative and with ill intentions and ill will, which is interesting to me. I see that as that paradox where people are responding to their own ignorance of psychological principles and then jump to conclusions and judgments rather than attempting at really understanding one another and where these misconceptions actually come from. So that's important. You may see that in partnerships and react to the presentation instead of what is really going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, kind of, what is happening internally with this person. So if you see that, then please remind yourself that you may be dealing with that completely low anxiety, high avoidance attachment style, where they're comfortable really not engaging, and it's more our own discomfort of their comfort not engaging that leads to us projecting certain values and judgments on them, including those negative ones that I mentioned, and leads to more misunderstanding. Now, on the other hand, you may have an avoidant style who is highly anxious, and the way you would see it is that they are saying that they don't want to go further with this, the discussion and analysis and opening up, etc. And then they start getting upset and angry, and even so you see the escalation in them. And literally by seeing what I mean is you observe it in totality. You hear there's some frustration in the tone of voice. You observe body language. Eye contact is very important. You can see it and also hear it and kind of sense it in the room. In totality of their interactions and presentations, they're quite uncomfortable. They're kind of burning up inside. They could explode at any moment. They may, and in fact, that's when you see a lot of the individuals with high anxiety and low approachability or high avoidance, where it comes to a point where they just walk away. One of the characteristics that they're highly in turmoil and anxious and not comfortable with actually being avoidant, if you will, or being in that conflictual situation, is that they literally just walk away. So short of exploding, you may see them completely disengage, walk away, not wanting to talk. And again, if we don't understand that, what we may attribute that action to is more of a ill intention, ill will, kind of maybe at times disrespect or insult, and again some level of conceit or unwillingness to engage and lack of caring a lot of times. And on both ends, actually, we may attribute lack of caring to both individuals, whereas what they are really just doing, they're doing some conflict resolution in their own way. They are trying to stay away and de-escalate, but their way of de-escalation is more internal and individual rather than interpersonal, whereas individuals with high approachability on the high end of the approachability scale, their conflict resolution and de-escalation is more interpersonal rather than internal and intrapersonal. So with that in mind, let's move towards some kind of combinations. As I have mentioned earlier, I brought up like a combination of, let's say, secure and preoccupied in the other video, but here I'm going to say bring up a combination of secure and, let's say, one of these attachment styles. So here with a secure person, being able to remain less anxious, do some self-soothing, separate the anxiety intensity of discussions from the actual relationship, still feel secure within the relationship and their attachment and connection to others, and high desirability to remain connected and attached to another individuals. They may engage with any of these other insecure styles in a way that they're capable of kind of having these intense discussions, kind of ending it, putting it on pause, tabling the conversation, the difference discussion, delaying it and still coming back and revisiting, and none of that has any reflection, any meaningfully negative and long-lasting negative reflection or also impact on the attachment and their desirability for remaining connected and in the relationship and feeling cared for and secure. So, however, because the insecure types are not capable of doing so, what happens is they may actually revert and at times also regress to a certain very much internal insecurity that would lead them to change their belief and conviction about the relationship, about the attachment. So the way it would look like generally that the ambivalent, I'm sorry, not the ambivalent, generally both the avoidance, whether it's the pure avoidant or the fearful avoidant slash ambivalent, that they may simply start literally just kind of disconnecting emotionally completely from the relationship, remain fearful of conflict, kind of fall deeper into their own world and disconnecting from the relationship altogether, even at peaceful times. Because more or less what they have learned is that it doesn't seem like any type of interaction is helpful and working, and even good interactions are not really leading to a better time, and they become more or less roommates. And another part of it is that because they're not willing to actually engage in a conflict resolution in an interpersonal style, they may not even leave the relationship, and or if they do leave the relationship, they may just do it quietly. Just like when they walk away from a conversation, they may decide that it's time to turn in the divorce papers, and that's about it, without any warning, without anything. They have made up their mind and they take action. So they don't include their partner in some kind of a negotiation about that action. They may simply just end up, like I mentioned, making up their mind, walking away permanently, moving out of their home, packing and leaving, seeking divorce before or after, if it is even necessary. At times they're not married, so they may not even seek divorce. So you may get that type of an reaction, or more or less an exasperated and exacerbated version of the walking away. Just like the walk away from conversations, and an exacerbated version of that is turning in the divorce papers, moving out without notice, packing up the stuff and leaving. And at times you may also unfortunately get that with kids involved, where a person may literally pick up the kids and leave without any warning, which is one of the most terrible things to do in a relationship. But then we have talked about the style, the preoccupied, where they are highly clingy and relentless. They don't let go of conversations. We have also at times alluded to this combination that we may have getting between, basically, for instance, two avoidants. It could be from this category or from this category, but both of them being avoidant. But if two partners within a relationship, they're both avoidant. So what happens is that you generally don't get much of a debate or argument between them. They kind of stay away from these types of opportunities of friction and conflict. They generally don't really get to know each other much. They kind of have this stalemate going on between them. At times, they more or less they may spill the beans, if you will, to a trusted person. They may open, or to a therapist, or to a family member and so forth, who is close enough for to hear them out, but they don't bring it into the relationship. So they really grow old as roommates, and also the sparks, the romance and the chemistry between them dies down. So they just kind of it's kind of an unfortunate, sad situation, but you get that at times, and they really distance and walk away from each other, even though they live together. So spiritually, emotionally, in any meaningful way, they're not connected. So it's more of a facade and convenience of the situation that they're together, and perhaps preventing further pain and discomfort if they decided to actually separate permanently from one another. And or, as I mentioned, you may even get too avoidant to just completely drop the ball and not even talk to each other anymore, not see any reason for that, and both of them literally just moving out whether it's at the same time or different times, but actually being comfortable with that type of a almost silent breakup. Now, if you get like I mentioned, any of these three, insecure and insecure, hopefully there would be some opportunity for the insecure to more or less learn how the secure person is interacting with, in this type of situations, for the preoccupied to learn self-regulation, to kind of get on this level of low anxiety, as they're already capable of approachability and seeking and desiring relationships, for the avoidance to learn that there is benefit in actually approaching others and resolving issues and conflicts within relationships, and learning the benefit of interacting with other human beings, especially the significant other. That's what they can glean from the secure style, which really hinges on one important change, and that is learning how to change their conversation and convert them from a debate and argument into what we call a dialogue. In fact, all three would benefit from that. That would be the fast track to converting one's attachment style into a secure attachment style, if they learn to really engage in a dialogue of what we call dialogue of intimacy, dialogue of understanding, versus arguments and debates. Lastly, what I would bring up is the combination of a preoccupied and avoidant. So what we have here, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier as to the presentation of each, but basically they trigger each other. What happens is that the entire moving away from wanting to engage in a relationship that is characteristic of the avoidance styles is triggering anxieties in preoccupied and moving the preoccupied, if they have not learned self-regulation, even toward higher anxiety, because they're highly reliant on the other individual, and the other individual, the significant other in the relationship, is pulling away, and that pulling away creates more anxiety for the preoccupied. So the preoccupied becomes less safe and secure in their erroneous way of relying so heavily on their significant other. They believe that pulling away is almost like adding insult to the injury, basically. Even a further proof of the lack of caring and love and appreciation and value or valuation, if you will, of their partner, of themselves. So and what happens is, the more anxious they become, the more clingy, the more needy they become, which is basically putting a high demand and pressure on the avoidance to re-engage in the relationship, which they hate, because they see that whole pull and demand and pressure to re-engage in the relationship as a source of the conflict and their own discomfort, whether it is with high anxiety or low anxiety. They see that as detrimental, because they have learned to rely on themselves, and now they're being faced with a different proposition, that they should actually do the opposite of what they have learned, to rely less on themselves, on their internal resources, and more highly on the other people, other individual, or the relationship, which in the first place is the source of anxiety. What happens if you do get two individuals with these different types of avoidant and preoccupied, or avoidant anxious type of combination? I would regard that as almost like the best combination, because what happens is, despite its triggering methodology between them, they are more or less a source of learning and a role model for one another, what should be done. If we look at the positive sides that they bring to the table, with the preoccupied role modeling that there is a benefit in relationship, that we don't have to be afraid by relationships themselves, by attachment themselves, that we can welcome relationship. We can see some kind of a comfort or some kind of a source of security and safety in relationships. So they could role model that, and by simply focusing more on the positive sides of relationship and displaying more positive aspects of a benefit of a relationship, being in a relationship. And the avoidant, if they were capable of really articulating what's going on in their self-regulation, being the role model for self-regulation, being the role model of, these are the things that you do by yourself in order to calm down. You don't have to rely heavily on other people. You have certain resources inside that you can engage in, and you're a human being with intrapsychic tools and resources that are quite functional and capable and useful. So if they actually were able to have a dialogue, as I mentioned earlier, that would be the key to transferring their attachment styles into more secure attachment styles, then they actually would be the best combination for one another, short of a combination of what I mentioned earlier, is secure and insecure. Certainly secure and insecure would be top of my list to see that combination, because most likely and hopefully the insecure attachment can learn from the secure one and become more secure. And then the second best combination would be the anxious versus avoidant. The third one, they're not really best, but it can happen, as I mentioned earlier, would be the avoidant. Two people that have avoidant styles, they may really just end up becoming roommates, like I mentioned, just kind of peaceful roommates rather than romantic partners. And they may end up separating, or they may kind of live the rest of their lives together kind of miserably, which is not very good. And then lastly would be the preoccupied. That's, I would suggest, the worst type of combination. And the reason for that is because they're so highly dependent on each other's behaviors to self-soothe that when they escalate, they may actually step into aggression and violence, because they just can't calm themselves down, and they, through a series of misconceptions, misinterpretations, accusations, projections of ill will and lack of caring and perceived sense of insult and injury, basically, that is caused more or less by the actions of the other partner, they may actually end up at each other's throats, really, especially if they have had history of abuse growing up, or watching or seeing violence, domestic violence especially, if that has been ingrained and role modeled in their psyche, and that's what they see as the norm or the next logical step to take, or just in the heat of that emotional intense interaction, they may just simply snap in the moment. And so those preoccupied attachment styles are at the bottom of the list, really, in terms of a compatibility. Even though they're the same category, they're highly toxic for one another. I hope that we have been able to shed some light on this complexity of all these attachment styles. And I know it's very complex, and I'm not the best explaining all these, but I hope that some of this information is helpful to you in terms of being able to discern between these styles and how they impact and affect each other and relationship, and the seeming presence and message that they send to people that may be quite erroneous. They may be quite different than what is really happening. So hope you enjoyed that. If you would like to hear more about certain specific differences, if you have specific examples, I would love to create another clip and responding to your questions. Please post your questions. Let us know what you would like to know more about, and we would love to create more videos. Also subscribe if you haven't done so, to receive more videos in the future. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.